$10. That's what the small hand clutched, crumpled and damp from the relentless rain. As the young boy stood at the edge of the neon-lit street, his gaze fixed on the man everyone in the district feared. He knew his reputation from hushed warnings in shop doorways, knew he wasn't someone a child should approach. The air hung heavy with moisture and exhaust fumes as the evening rain transformed the pavement into a mirror of colored lights, red, blue, gold, casting shimmering reflections across the wet asphalt. Street vendors packed their carts in the distance, their voices fading into the steady drum of rainfall that echoed through the narrow alley. Lucien Moreau emerged from his luxury sedan, his tailored suit immaculate despite the downpour, his presence commanding even in the chaos of the storm. No bodyguard opened his door. Yet something intangible seemed to create a barrier around him, keeping the world at bay. As if the rain itself knew to fall more gently in his face. Power protects power. Weakness invites destruction. He had lived by this code for decades, a philosophy that carved his empire from the city's underbelly. Tonight, ironically, he was the one vulnerable. A rare moment between appointments that exposed him to the unpredictable, away from the fortress of his office and the shield of his men, carrying the weight of territories controlled and debts collected. The neon signs flickered overhead, their electric buzz competing with the rain's rhythm as late-night workers hurried past with umbrellas, heads down, carefully avoiding eye contact with the man beside the expensive car. Lucien glanced at his watch, a platinum timepiece worth more than most families earned in a year, and calculated how long the stop would take before his next meeting demanded his presence. This street corner had become his checkpoint over the years, a necessary pause in the perpetual motion of his operations where he could observe his domain unfiltered. Here, surrounded by the raw pulse of the city's nightlife, the desperate, the ambitious, the forgotten, he could almost remember the boy he'd been before choices hardened into destiny. If you're already hooked by this story, hit that like button right now and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another tale of redemption and unexpected humanity. Now, let me tell you what happened next. The rain had started as a whisper 2 hours ago, when Lucien Moreau collected his first payment of the evening from the restaurant owner on Merchant Street. By the second stop, a gambling den tucked behind a legitimate tea house, it had grown insistent, drumming against the car's roof like impatient fingers. Now, as his driver navigated the serpentine streets of the district, the downpour had transformed the city into something almost beautiful. Neon signs bled their colors across flooded gutters, turning ordinary water into rivers of electric light. Moreau watched it all from behind tinted windows, his expression unreadable. The leather seat beneath him still held the warmth of the previous stop, where a nightclub owner had handed over the week's tribute with trembling hands. Not from cold. From the understanding of what delayed payment meant in Moreau's world. Power protects power. Weakness invites destruction. The words weren't merely a philosophy, they were survival distilled into 8 syllables. He'd learned them in back alleys where hesitation meant death, had refined them in boardrooms where mercy was a liability. They'd built his empire from nothing, transforming a street-smart orphan into the man who controlled 12 blocks of the city's most profitable territory. The Chin brothers paid double, his driver, Marcus, said from the front seat, eyes never leaving the rain-slicked road. Said to consider it an investment in goodwill. Moreau's lips barely moved. Fear masquerading as friendship. The most reliable kind. 3 more stops remained on tonight's route. 3 more performances of the role he'd perfected, the measured words, the weighted silences, the careful calibration of threat that never needed to become explicit. Each interaction was a chess move, every conversation a negotiation where he held all the pieces that mattered. By the time he returned to his penthouse, another week's dominance would be cemented, another layer added to the legend that kept challenges at bay. But God, he was tired. Not physically. His body remained disciplined, honed by the same rigorous schedule he'd maintained for 20 years. The exhaustion lived deeper, in the space where something human had once resided. Each collected debt, Each enforced rule, each moment of calculated intimidation carved away another fragment of whatever man he might have been. The performance of power was relentless, demanding, allowing no weakness, no hesitation, no moment of simple existence without calculation. The car slowed at a red light, rain hammering harder now, and Morrow caught his reflection in the window. Still young enough at 38 to be dangerous, old enough to understand the cost. The face that stared back was his and not his, a mask worn so long it had fused to the skin beneath. "Next stop, sir," Marcus asked. Morrow checked his watch. The warehouse district. The metalwork supplier. Tonight would be like every other night. Collections made, respect enforced, empire maintained. The machinery of power grinding forward with the inevitability of dawn. Except something felt different in the rain-soaked air, a charge like electricity before lightning strikes. Morrow dismissed it as fatigue, the weight of too many identical evenings blurring together. He didn't know that tonight, something would break his carefully maintained distance. That the next stop would bring not another trembling debtor, but a soaked boy with impossible courage and 10 crumpled dollars that would crack the foundation of everything he'd built. The light changed. The car moved forward. And Lucien Moreau, untouchable emperor of 12 city blocks, drove unknowingly toward the moment that would remind him he was, despite everything, still human. Moreau saw the boy before Marcus did. A small figure materializing from the rain-blurred darkness, like something conjured from the storm itself, standing beneath the broken awning of a shuttered electronics shop. Most people had the instinct to look away when his car approached, to suddenly find fascination in their phones or the nearest storefront. This child stared directly at the tinted windows with an intensity that registered as either foolishness or desperation. "Sir," Marcus began, hand moving toward the door lock. "Wait." Morrow leaned forward slightly, studying the figure. A boy, perhaps 10 or 11, drowning in a school uniform that had seen too many washes and not enough replacements. The white shirt clung to thin shoulders, translucent with rain, and the dark pants were rolled at the ankles, revealing shoes held together more by habit than by any remaining structural integrity. A backpack sagged against his spine, heavy with something that made his small frame list slightly to one side. The car stopped at the curb, engine idling. Moreau opened his door before Marcus could round the vehicle, stepping into the rain with the practiced ease of a man who'd long ago stopped concerning himself with weather. The boy moved then, peeling away from his inadequate shelter with a kind of determination that cut through rain and darkness like a blade through silk. No hesitation in his steps despite the tremor Moreau could see running through his body, from cold or fear, impossible to say. Probably both. Marcus materialized at Moreau's shoulder, imposing despite the downpour, one hand inside his jacket in the universal gesture of armed readiness. The boy faltered for half a step, then continued forward. Moreau raised a hand, subtle but absolute. Marcus held position, though every line of his posture radiated professional disapproval. The child stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to run if necessary. Smart. The rain fell between them, heavy and cold, turning the moment into something suspended outside normal time. Neon signs from the shops behind cast their glow across the boy's upturned face, blue from the pharmacy, red from the pawn shop, gold from the restaurant that never seemed to close. His skin looked almost translucent in the artificial light, eyes too large and too old for that young face. "Are you Lucien Moreau?" The question emerged through chattering teeth, but the voice held steady. No pleaser, sir, just the direct question of someone who'd already exhausted every other option. Moreau felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he couldn't immediately identify. This child shouldn't know his name. Shouldn't be here, standing in a downpour at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, looking at him with eyes that held no illusions about who or what Lucien Moreau was. Children belonged in warm homes with homework and bedtimes, not in rain-soaked streets seeking out men whose reputations were built on calculated violence. Depends, Morrow said finally, his voice low. On who's asking? The boy's hand moved to his pocket, and Marcus tensed. But what emerged wasn't a weapon, it was something far more dangerous. A crumpled bill, held out with both hands like an offering to something ancient and unpredictable. Someone, the boy said, rain streaming down his face, who needs help that only you can give. The boy took one step closer, arms extending with a formality that seemed rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this moment in his mind until every gesture carried weight. The $10 bill between his small fingers was crumpled, softened by handling, the edges worn to the texture of fabric. Rain pelted it, but the boy's grip remained steady, unwavering. Sir, I need to hire you. The words came out with such sincerity that Moreau felt the ghost of a smile threatening. This is all I have. The absurdity of it struck him first. This child, soaked to the bone and shaking, attempting to conduct business as if they stood in some corporate boardroom rather than a flooded street in the district's forgotten corner. As if $10 could purchase anything from a man whose monthly income moved in numbers that required accountants and offshore accounts to track. Moreau's amusement began to form, that detached observation of life's small ironies that had sustained him through countless bizarre encounters. But then he looked, truly looked, into the boy's eyes, and the amusement died before it could reach his lips. There was no innocence there. No childish fantasy or misunderstanding of what he was asking. Just desperate calculation and the terrible clarity of someone who'd already weighed every other option and found them wanting. The rain intensified, drumming harder against the car's roof behind them, a staccato rhythm that matched the acceleration of something Moreau didn't want to name. Water streamed down both their faces now, the storm having reached the point where umbrellas became theatrical gestures rather than practical tools. The boy shivered, a violent tremor that rippled through his entire frame, but his hands never lowered. His gaze never wavered. Marcus shifted closer, radiating disapproval, but Moreau ignored him. Something about this moment demanded his full attention, pulled at a part of himself he'd thought successfully buried years ago. Moreau reached out and took the bill. The paper was warm from the boy's grip, almost alive against his palm. He turned it over, noting how the creases had been pressed flat repeatedly, how the corners had been folded and refolded with obsessive precision. This wasn't money casually pulled from a pocket. This was money saved, coin by coin, probably over weeks or months. Hidden away, protected, invested with the kind of hope that only desperation creates. The silence between them filled with rain and the electric hum of neon signs, with the distant rush of traffic and the closer sound of water gurgling through storm drains. The city continued around them, indifferent to whatever transaction was unfolding on this anonymous street corner. What, Moreau said finally, his voice carrying a roughness he hadn't intended, does $10 buy from a man like me? The boy's throat worked, swallowing hard. When he spoke, his voice cracked on the words, but the conviction behind them remained unshaken. My mother's life. Maybe mine too. That's what I'm hoping it buys. The story came out in fragments, words stumbling over themselves as if the boy feared losing his courage mid-sentence. His grandmother had gotten sick 6 months ago, cancer, the kind that required medicine the public hospitals couldn't provide. His mother had borrowed from men who operated out of the massage parlor on 3rd Street, men whose interest rates compounded faster than hope could keep pace. She thought she could pay it back, Owen said, rain streaming down his face like tears his pride wouldn't allow. She took extra shifts at the factory. I helped. But the interest kept growing, and they kept adding fees, late fees, processing fees, protection fees. His voice cracked on the last word, heavy with bitter irony. The threats had started 3 weeks ago. Phone calls first, then visits. Men who stood outside their apartment building, smoking cigarettes and staring at windows until his mother closed all the curtains. Yesterday, they'd grabbed her arm in the street, left bruises that circled her wrist like a bracelet. Tonight, they'd told her they were done waiting. They'd come at 10 o'clock to collect what was owed, one way or another. My father left when I was 6, Owen continued, the words mechanical now, reciting facts to keep from drowning in them. It's just us. Just me and her. Morrow saw it then, flashes of this boy's recent history written in his appearance. The calloused hands from collecting bottles and cans, hauling them to recycling centers for pennies per pound. The mended uniform, careful stitches in the collar where fabric had torn. The worn shoes that had probably been too large when bought, purchased with the hope he'd grow into them. Every coin saved, every meal skipped, every small sacrifice building toward this impossible moment. The shopkeeper, Mr. Chin, 2 streets over, he said you control this district. Owen's teeth chattered harder, but he pushed through. He said the sharks answer to you. That nothing happens here without your permission. The logic was simple, desperate, and entirely accurate. If Morrow told the loan sharks to forgive a debt, it would be forgiven. If he declared someone under his protection, they became untouchable. One word from him could solve this boy's entire world. If you tell them to stop, Owen said, voice dropping to barely above a whisper, they'll stop. You're the only one who can. Morrow's internal landscape shifted, fault lines cracking through carefully constructed walls. His rules were clear. Street-level operations remained beneath his direct involvement. The loan sharks paid him tribute monthly. What they did with their collections was their concern, not his. Interference would signal weakness, suggest he could be moved by sentiment, invite every desperate case in 12 blocks to come seeking miracles. But something in this boy's courage, walking through rain to find the most dangerous man in the district, offering everything he had for the impossible, struck deeper than rules or reputation. Morrow was 12 again suddenly, standing in a cramped apartment, watching men in cheap suits threaten his own mother while he remained powerless, small, invisible. Watching the moment that would forge him into exactly what he'd needed then, someone with the power to make threats disappear. He'd sworn no one would ever make him feel that helpless again. But standing here, looking at Owen's desperate hope, he realized he'd become something worse, the person with power who might walk away. The memory arrived unbidden, sharp-edged despite 2 decades of burial. Morrow was 12, standing in their apartment's narrow hallway while 2 men filled the doorway with their bulk and their threats. His mother had borrowed money for his school fees, the good school, the one that might lift them out of the cycle. The interest had consumed her wages, left them choosing between electricity and food. He remembered the neighbor, Mr. Wei, watching from across the hall. A man with connections, with enough standing in the community that one word from him might have mattered. Their eyes had met, Morrow's young and pleading, Wei's calculating and cold. Then the door had closed. The choice made. Not his problem. Not his concern. 3 days later, his mother had signed over their apartment's deed, and they'd moved to a single room above a restaurant where cockroaches outnumbered tenants. That night, lying on a mattress that smelled of strangers and defeat, Morrow had made his promise. Never again. Never helpless. Never powerless. Never at the mercy of men who could walk away. He'd built his empire on that vow, clawed his way up from nothing until he became the one people feared, the one who controlled outcomes, the one who made others wait for his decisions. Power protecting power. Weakness inviting destruction. The philosophy had worked. It had made him untouchable. But standing here in the rain, looking at Owen's desperate hope, Morrow confronted the question he'd spent 20 years avoiding. In his climb to power, had he become Mr. Wei? The man who looked at suffering and calculated whether involvement served his interests? The person who closed doors on desperate eyes? Owen waited, rain streaming down his face, mixing with what might have been tears if the boy would acknowledge them. His hands had lowered finally, the $10 clutched against his chest. Hope was dying by degrees in his expression. Morrow could see it happening, the light dimming as seconds stretched and no answer came. The boy had gambled everything on this moment, and the silence was its own verdict. Morrow's mind calculated with mechanical precision. Helping meant showing sentiment, revealing the weakness his reputation couldn't afford. Word would spread that Lucien Moreau could be moved by sob stories, that emotion trumped business. Every desperate case would come seeking miracles. His carefully constructed authority would erode. But refusing meant becoming exactly what he'd hated. Meant being the man who walked away. Meant that 12-year-old version of himself, still living somewhere deep inside, would finally die completely. The crossroads was visible in his eyes, Owen watching it happen, understanding even through his fear that something was being weighed, measured, decided. Get in the car. The words came out rougher than intended, cutting through rain and neon hum. Owen's expression shifted from dying hope to shock, then confusion. His body tensed, instinct warring with desperation. Was this help or a different kind of danger? Had he traded one threat for another? Moreau moved past him toward the vehicle, pulling the door open. Marcus stood frozen, professional mask slipping into genuine surprise. Your mother, Moreau said, not turning around, rain soaking through his expensive suit. Where is she? This story gets even more powerful from here. If you're invested in Owen and Moreau's journey, show your support with a like and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more people. Now, back to that rain-soaked night. The interior of the car enveloped Owen like another world, leather seats that probably cost more than a year's rent, technology blinking softly on the dashboard, warmth pouring from vents that drove away the rain's chill but couldn't touch the cold living deeper in his bones. He sat rigid on the edge of the seat, dripping water onto carpeting that had likely never known such indignity, overwhelmed by the sudden contrast between the street's harsh reality and this cocoon of wealth. Moreau pulled out his phone, thumbs moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. 3rd Street Massage Parlor. Find out who runs collections in the Riverside district. His voice was clipped, emotionless, each word carrying weight that didn't require volume. A pause. Chen's territory. I know. Tell him I'm calling in the favor from September. Another pause, longer this time. Tonight. Within the hour. The car moved through rain-washed streets, Marcus driving with the smooth confidence of someone who'd learned to become invisible while remaining alert. Owen watched the city blur past windows streaked with water, neon signs becoming abstract streams of color, red bleeding into gold, blue merging with green. His neighborhood looked different from this leather-wrapped perspective, smaller somehow, as if seeing it through Moreau's windows diminished its ability to hurt him. Your address, Moreau said, not looking up from his phone. Riverside Apartments. Building 7, Unit 412. Owen's voice came out steadier than he felt. They said they'd come at 10. Moreau glanced at the dashboard clock. 9:43. He made another call, this one even more cryptic, words that sounded like business, but carried threat beneath their surface pleasantries. Owen watched his profile, the sharp jawline, the eyes that missed nothing, the face that had learned to reveal only what it chose. How old are you? Moreau asked suddenly. 11. 12 next month. Moreau's gaze dropped to Owen's hands, noting the calluses on palms too young for such marks, the dirt embedded under fingernails that no amount of scrubbing quite removed. His eyes traveled to the uniform's collar, where careful stitches held torn fabric together, to the backpack's frayed straps mended with mismatched thread. You shouldn't have come to me. The statement held no anger, just a kind of weary honesty. I'm not a good man. Owen turned from the window, meeting those dangerous eyes with a directness that surprised them both. Good men couldn't help me. I needed a powerful one. The words hung in the space between them, simple and devastating in their clarity. Moreau felt something shift in his chest again, that same sensation from the street, but deeper now, more insistent. This child understood what most adults spent lifetimes learning, that morality was a luxury of the secure, that survival sometimes required dancing with darkness. The wisdom in those words unsettled Moreau more than any threat he'd faced, any challenge to his authority. Because Owen was right, and that rightness indicted everything Moreau had built his identity upon. The riverside apartments materialized through the rain, a concrete monument to the city's forgotten, paint peeling, windows dark except for the flickering blue glow of cheap televisions. 3 men stood under the building's overhang, sharing a cigarette, radiating the casual menace of those who'd learned violence as a trade. Moreau recognized them. Chen's crew. Street-level collectors who operated just beneath his notice, paying their monthly tribute and staying out of larger conflicts. "Stay in the car," he said, his voice dropping to something harder, colder. "Lock the doors. No matter what you hear." Moreau stepped from the car into rain that had settled into a steady, patient rhythm. The 3 men noticed him immediately. You didn't survive long in this business without recognizing predators higher up the food chain. Their casual postures stiffened, cigarette forgotten, cocky grins fading into the wary calculation of those suddenly realizing they'd wandered into the wrong territory. The lead collector was maybe 30, scar tissue mapping old fights across his knuckles, wearing the kind of leather jacket that tried too hard to intimidate. His eyes widened with recognition, then something closer to fear. "Mr. Moreau. We didn't. We're just here on collection business." "Not anymore." Moreau's voice never rose above conversational level, but something in its timbre made the men step back instinctively, bodies responding to danger their conscious minds were still processing. "The Hayes family. Unit 412. Their debt is paid." The scarred man's confusion was genuine. "Sir," Chen said. "I don't care what Chen said." Moreau moved closer, rain streaming off his shoulders, his presence somehow making the night feel colder. "I'm telling you now. The debt is paid. You're done here. If I hear you've returned, if I hear you've so much as looked at that apartment, it's your debt I'll collect. And I promise, my interest rates are considerably less forgiving." The threat needed no elaboration. These men operated in violence's periphery, but Moreau lived at its center. They understood the difference between their local power and his absolute authority. The lead collector nodded, throat working, trying to salvage some dignity from the encounter. Moreau reached into his pocket, withdrew the crumpled $10 bill, and placed it in the man's palm. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical. "Tell Chen this covered it. Tell him we're square." The message was clear, not payment, but a statement. A line drawn. The men left quickly, footsteps splashing through puddles, understanding they'd just escaped something that could have gone much worse. Moreau entered the building, climbing stairs that smelled of old cooking oil and resigned poverty, until he reached Unit 412. The woman who answered his knock was Owen's mother in every feature, the same dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure weathered by hardship. Fear lived in her expression until recognition replaced it, then confusion. "The debt is cleared," Moreau said simply. "No obligation owed. You and your son are under my protection now." Her hand went to her mouth, tears immediate and overwhelming. She tried to speak, to thank him, to understand what miracle had descended from the rain-soaked night. Words failed her, dissolving into gratitude too large for language. Moreau shifted uncomfortably, and used to this kind of attention, this raw emotion. "Thank your son. He's braver than most men I know." He turned before she could respond, before the tears could pull something from him he wasn't ready to give. Back in the car, Owen's face was pressed to the window, watching everything, his expression cycling through relief, disbelief, and something that might have been hope learning it was allowed to exist. Marcus pulled away from the curb as Moreau settled into the leather seat, and neither man spoke as they drove through streets that looked somehow different now, as if the rain had washed away more than just the day's grime. The rain began to ease as they drove back toward Owen's building, the relentless downpour softening into something gentler, almost apologetic. The neon signs remained, but their reflections on wet pavement grew sharper, less abstract, as if the city was slowly coming back into focus after a fevered dream. Owen sat deeper in the seat now, the adrenaline that had carried him through the last hour draining away like water through a grate. His body sagged with the weight of exhaustion postponed, reality settling in with the slow creep of dawn after a long night. He was just a boy again, soaked, tired, overwhelmed, rather than the desperate courier of impossible requests he'd forced himself to become. Sir. His voice emerged small and certain. I still need to pay you. The $10 isn't enough for what you did. Morrow looked at him then, really looked, seeing not just the moment, but the lifetime that had shaped it, every skipped meal, every bottle collected, every choice made in service of survival. I'm keeping the $10, he said quietly. But not as payment. Owen's confusion was immediate, the mental arithmetic not adding up. If not payment, then what? As a reminder, Morrow's gaze returned to the rain-streaked window, to the city he'd conquered and controlled. You taught me something tonight that I'd forgotten. That's worth more than money. The boy was too young to fully understand. That much was clear in his furrowed brow, the questions forming and dissolving behind his eyes. What could he possibly teach someone like Lucien Moreau? What wisdom could a child offer to a man who commanded 12 blocks and made loan sharks disappear with a phone call? Moreau felt the words rising before he could stop them, pulled from some buried place by this boy's courage. I was you once. Exactly where you were tonight, needing help I had no right to ask for. His voice dropped lower, rough with memory. No one came when I needed them. I promised myself then that I'd never be that helpless again. The car slowed in front of Owen's building, the shabby concrete looking somehow less oppressive now, as if possibility had returned to its forgotten corners. But I didn't promise myself I'd help others when they were helpless. I forgot that part. You reminded me. Owen reached for the door handle, then hesitated, some part of him understanding that this moment mattered in ways he couldn't yet articulate. Thank you, sir. For my mother. For everything. Go. Moreau's tone gentled into something almost paternal. She's waiting. The boy pushed open the door and ran through the thinning rain, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, shoes splashing through puddles that had stopped being obstacles and become just water again. At the building's entrance, he stopped, turned back, and bowed deeply formally, a gesture from another generation, taught perhaps by the grandmother whose medicine had started this entire cascade of debt and desperation and unlikely salvation. Moreau watched until Owen disappeared into the building, watched as lights came on in Unit 412, watched as shadows moved behind curtains, mother and son reunited in the safety he'd granted with nothing more than his word and his reputation. Marcus waited patiently, engine idling, understanding without being told that they wouldn't leave until the job was truly finished. The lights stayed on, warm and steady. The rain continued to ease. And Lucien Moreau, emperor of 12 city blocks, allowed himself something he rarely permitted, the knowledge that tonight, power had protected something besides itself. 3 weeks passed before the $10 bill found its permanent home on Moreau's office wall, pinned beside maps of his territory and photographs that documented 2 decades of calculated empire building. It looked absurd there, crumpled, faded, worth less than the frame that might have held it, but Moreau found his eyes drawn to it during phone calls, during meetings, during the quiet hours when the city slept and he remained awake, keeping watch over what he'd built. His operations continued with their usual efficiency, collections made and territories maintained, but subtle shifts rippled through his organization like cracks spreading through ice. A gambling debt forgiven when his men discovered 3 children, depending on the debtor's income. A restaurant owner given extended terms after mentioning his daughter's school fees. Word spread through the underworld's whispered networks, Moreau's new line. Families with kids had become untouchable, a category of protection that existed outside the usual calculations of profit and loss. His men adapted with the confused loyalty of soldiers following orders they didn't quite understand. Marcus asked no questions, but Moreau caught him looking sometimes, speculation in his eyes, wondering what had changed his boss during that rain-soaked night. Something had shifted in Lucien Moreau, some fundamental recalibration of what power meant and how it should be wielded. Owen's life had transformed in quieter ways. Back in school with new shoes that fit properly, A uniform without mended tears, his mother safe in a legitimate job Moreau had arranged through one of his front companies. The pay was fair, the work honest, and no one mentioned the debt that had once threatened to consume them. It had simply vanished, erased as if it had never existed, leaving only gratitude and the cautious hope that safety might last. The encounter happened on a Tuesday afternoon, Moreau's car passing through the district on routine business when he spotted a familiar figure walking home from school. Owen, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, head up instead of down, moving through the world like a child allowed to be a child again. The boy spotted the car, recognition immediate, and stopped on the sidewalk. The bow came naturally, that same deep gesture of respect, and Moreau nodded acknowledgement through tinted glass, a moment of connection across an impossible divide. Power could destroy or protect, Moreau had learned. The choice defined the man more than any amount of money, any territory controlled, any reputation built on fear. He'd spent 20 years becoming someone who couldn't be hurt, only to discover that being someone who could help mattered more. Rain began to fall again as Marcus drove through neon-lit streets, the familiar drumming on the car's roof a rhythm Moreau had learned to associate with transformation. But this rain felt different somehow, cleansing rather than oppressive, washing the city clean without drowning it. The darkness remained, it always would in a place like this, but it felt less absolute, as if small lights had been lit in forgotten corners. $10 couldn't buy power, Moreau thought, his reflection staring back from the rain-streaked window. But it could buy something far more valuable, a reason to use it right. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more tales that explore the complexity of human nature. And here's something I'd love to know. Drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are and what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how these stories connect people across the world. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that power, when used right, can change everything. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.